Welcome to cEDH Pleasure Brews. I'm Tim, and tonight I'm going to discuss mid-range and what I think about it in the current meta. But before we get started, please check out our Discord and our Patreon. Links are in the description below. And if you like our content, please hit that like, share, subscribe. It really helps out a lot. So, initially, I was doing research for this video. I wanted to see what mid-range would look like in the current meta. Some of the decks that kind of come to mind, at least for me, are like Blue Farm, Corval Treasure Storm, Cannon, Dawnwaker Thrasios, and other various Tymna Thrasios shells. And then some of the stuff that kind of comes to mind thinking of comparing it to 1v1 would be old modern Jund with Tarmogoyfs and oh god, why am I drawing a blank on the Cascade Elf? Don't know. Can't think of it. Drawing a total blank. Don't have it sitting in front of me. But here we are. Or old rock decks. You know, the black, green, white decks that at one point were during Lorwyn we'll play Doran or the Abzan list during Con standard. Those are non-blue typical what I would consider kind of classic looking 1v1 mid-range decks where they just kind of grind you out, but they're not too slow that nobody's gonna you're not gonna be sitting around forever. Now, the thing is though, is that these decks do grind value and they bury your opponents in card quality. But kind of that illustrates one of the best aspects of mid-range is the deck's flexibility. The ability to close the game out fast when needed, but go long as well. And how they tend to be flexible enough to assume roles as needed. The downside is that they're neither the fastest nor the grindiest, right? They will have a slightly higher mana value than turbo decks. They'll have a slightly slimmer average mana value than hard control / stacks decks. So you might be asking yourself, why are there myths about mid-range? When everything I've said thus far is essentially kind of aligned with conventional wisdom, right? So if you look at the decks I mentioned earlier and any other kind of well-performing deck that most people would consider mid-range, you'll find, particularly when they apply to Commander or cEDH or multiplayer, that decks like Cannon and Blue Farm really aren't mid-range decks. At least not in the same sense as most 1v1 mid-range decks would be. The issue in multiplayer is that cards that you would often consider mid-range cards, at least in 1v1, tend to cut your opponents off of key avenues while you accrue value. But in multiplayer, that value is not as useful, since when you go down a card to answer a threat, you have two opponents who do not go down a card and do not lose a threat. So how do you grind out three players? Much like it was mentioned in the stacks video, you kind of really don't grind three players, especially when everybody's kind of playing on a similar keel, kind of at a similar power level, similarly optimized decks, even if they're not what you would consider top tier meta decks, they're still going to be on a similar power level. So a game of cEDH on average goes 4 to 6 turns. All right. That's not a lot of opportunity to kind of grind incremental value. Especially when you couple that with wheels, various draw engines like Esper Sentinel, Rhystic Study, and such. Even a Seaborn Muse, and I know nobody plays Seaborn Muse anymore. I get it. It's just kind of slow and chunky right now. But let's say you have a Seaborn Muse and you couple it with 2 cost reducers. So now you've got Seaborn down to 1 mana value. You will need to draw 3 cards to each of your opponent's 1 card. For each 1 card your 3 opponents draw, you need to draw 3 cards just to keep pace with the amount of cards you're fighting against. And when you tend to have like a Seaborn Muse and 2 cost reducers, you're definitely in a 3v1 situation. And that's like a huge investment, because to get cost reducers, get a Seaborn Muse, have Thrasios on board, still have mana open to protect it and interact, especially the turn that you kind of start deploying that stuff, is a lot to ask for and requires a lot of setup. So like for me, I kind of think that like the myth is that there actually is a mid-range archetype in the conventional sense in cEDH. I think the term just doesn't port over. And furthermore, how we think of decks we classify as mid-range is kind of dated at best. I did a video a while ago about Blue Farm where I talk about how important like passive card draw is and passive advantage engines. And maybe that's where mid-range really resides, in that space of that passive advantage. Instead of cards like Seaborn Muse paired with Thrasios, where you kind of keep having to like actively put stuff into them. Like, I don't know, a good example would be like a card like Wandering Archaic. Wandering Archaic is a great example of a card that will accrue you value. And you pay the investment once, and then every time somebody casts, an opponent casts in a sort of sorcery, you copy it unless they pay to. So they're either got a 2-mana tax added to everything, or you get a copy of whatever they play. That seems a little more, has a much higher ceiling than if, you know, because you're only paying it once. And then it does the work for us kind of over and over again. And like, I personally have found like that Thrasios is really better as a combo engine versus a card advantage engine. And that Tassiger is even worse, because not only does he cause colored mana requirements to activate, but also like your opponents get to pick what's going back in your hand. And the same thing with Thrasios. Thrasios, any card you draw, everybody knows what you got. So it's not like you're really kind of sticking stuff. The other thing with those kind of types of engines is that they're slow and that they require a huge mana investment. And a lot of times I'll have mana open all the way up to my end, like all the way up to the end step right before my untap. And then I'll just tap it to activate Thrasios, still leaving a mana or 2 open, obviously for interaction. But then somebody will just slip a spell in that it's like, maybe I don't have the interaction, or maybe it's just not worth getting to. And then I find that like down the road that kind of helped them set up for a win. Another thing is that like wheels make sculpting nigh impossible. So a lot of the mid-range decks, at least in the classical sense for multiplayer that we think of, are like the CST variants and stuff like that, really want you to be able to activate Thrasios or draw cards with Sylvan Library and then like sculpt over and over and over and over multiple turns, or over multiple turn cycles, to kind of get that perfect 7 to deploy a win. But the problem is that people are firing off wheels all the time, or there's a lot of risk studies. So it makes that sculpting just very, very difficult. Plus the game actions are condensed into 4 to 6 turns, not like 8 to 12 in a lot of the like mid-range or control mirrors in 1v1. So it just makes it really difficult. And then like with that sort of pacing, it makes that type of sculpting just very difficult to kind of have. And then lastly, in decks that play Tymna but like don't play Crom, I see a lot of like, particularly like Thrasios Tymna builds. I see that like my lack of having large creatures, or a 4/4 flyer mainly as an example, tends to make it so that my Tymna draws aren't as live as often, because there's often not very favorable attacks for me, or I don't have the fodder to be able to just kind of throw under the bus, and I don't want to start filling my deck up with bad cards to be able to leverage Tymna better, because then that dilutes my overall card quality. Now, I personally tend to see most decks that aren't fast, non-interactive combo decks really to be like tempo combo or combo control decks. Whereas like you're keeping your opponent off balance while you stick a threat and protect it. Now, in this case, the threat is going to be like a game-winning combo. You know, Oracle, Breach, Naws, Scepter, whatever it is, people, you know, Razakats with the LED loops and Bomberman, whatever the combo du jour is, or whatever combo your deck is using, you're going to try to stall the game out till you can get to it, while disrupting your opponents from getting to those. Like, this is what makes Tymna Crown Blue Farm so good. This is what makes Minoto so good. This is what makes Nagila so good. Is they are really, this is what they excel at. It's not that they're super fast turbo Nas decks. It's not that they're decks to beat. It's that they can stick a threat, protect it, disrupt their opponents, and execute their game plan all at the same time. And I know that there are plenty of other decks I'm just not naming. I'm just sticking with the obvious, because, you know, this is just going to be, you know, this just for this video. But the fact that they can do that really sets them apart. And there are other decks. I'm just kind of drawing a blank on them off the top of my head at the moment. So, and then next, some of the ways that decks can be built as tempo or combo control, like tempo combo and combo control decks, would be to play like the most efficient like permanent based interaction suite, and then mix that with stack interaction as well. So, for example, the 6 permanent based interaction pieces that I mentioned in the stacks video: Dranith, Avon, Op Agent, Dothy, Rest in Peace, and Grafdigger's Cage, amongst others. But those are the 6 that I really like and have found to be the most useful. And then you can kind of couple that with some stack interaction as well. Particularly like the free commander spells are really good. The forces are really good. Stuff like that. And then, since we're a budget-minded commander channel, I did want to go over some that are at least reasonably cost effective. I'm going to talk about those a little bit here. So, like, for example, I've got the budget spells interaction template up. This is on the Budget Brews website that I curate. So for white, I wanted to kind of discuss Silence. Silence is a 1 mana, it's a $5 spell, and it will prevent all of your opponents from casting spells for the rest of the game. So what makes this good as kind of a tempo card, or as a combo control card, is that you can use its flexibility. You can use it offensive and defensive. You can use it to protect your win, but then you can also use it to stop your opponents. For blue, a good one that comes to mind a lot, and I know it's a little more expensive, but it sees a lot of play, is Swan Song. Swan Song, again, is 1 mana, highly efficient. It hits a lot of relevant card types, and the downside is nominal because it gives them a 2/2 flyer. Well, as I said earlier, 2/2s tend to not attack very favorably, because now it being a token versus like one of your hate bears or something, sure, gives it a little more disposability, but it's still going to be hard to get through in a lot of instances. It hits instant sorcery and it hits enchantment. Now, obviously, that last clause is kind of the least relevant, but it does counter breach. It counters rule of laws. So it hits a lot of stuff. Now, in addition to Naws, in addition to stuff like that. The other thing, again, with this card is that you can use it offensively to protect your win, as well as defensively to kind of stop to disrupt your opponents. So you're going to kind of see a common theme here with like very compact, very flexible, very multi-use cards, right? With that flexibility, though, you do gain you do lose out on some narrowness that you would get from like more of the 2 mana interaction. But again, with the pacing of this meta, like I'm cutting mana drains from a lot of decks, Dovin's Vetoes from a lot of decks. I'm hemming and hawing over Abrupt Decay and Assassin's Trophy in a lot of decks. Not all, but most. And really sticking to that 1 mana is kind of seems like 1 mana and free kind of seems to be where I'm at these days a lot of times. Like 2 mana is a lot to pay for something in this economy. And just for it to be a negate with an uncounterable clause isn't fantastic. So I'm going to move on to black here. And I wanted to go over Cutdown. Cutdown is a 1 mana instant, destroy target creature with total power and toughness of 5 or less. All right. Doesn't hit everything, but it's one of the better 1 mana black pieces of removal because it hits most of the relevant hate bears that are played in the format. Like Aven, Op Agent, Dothi, Dranith. Just to name a few. Just to name the most played ones. It'll kill Tymnus, it'll kill Thrasios, it won't kill Crom, it won't kill Bruce, but it will kill it'll kill most relevant things. And out of the other kind of black permanent like spell-based interaction, it will hit a lot more than most of them. Another nice one that's free and cheap, if you're looking for like a sweeper, would be something like Massacre. Because the decks you want to play it against are generally going to be ones that have planes, and they're generally going to have a lot of X2s in play. Not all, but most. It domes you if you're playing Nas or if you're going real deep on Nas, but it's just kind of I just wanted to illustrate like a lower budget kind of free spell. But again, like just paying 1 mana versus some of the higher mana is really nice. And then for red, I wanted to kind of talk about Red Elemental Blast. Red Elemental Blast is good. Again, just a good example of if I'm playing a non-blue deck, I can use it to help kind of protect my win. I can also use it to help somebody else stop an opponent from winning. And then I can also use it to destroy things like Rhystic Studies and Croms and Mystic Remoras. Just to name a few. It can destroy blue permanents and counter blue spells. It's very easy to leverage proactively and reactively, and thus is a prime example of a stack-based interaction piece that is very flexible and would make good in these tempo combo, control combo decks that I'm kind of talking about. I wish I had a better term for what we would consider kind of these decks instead of mid-range. I just don't really have one. Honestly, if you have thoughts on kind of something to use for a term, drop it in the description. And, maybe we can start spreading the word on it. And then kind of moving on to green here. I chose a free spell for this one. Again, it's about the same price as Silence, about $5-6. I've seen it go up, but it's Noxious Revival. So Noxious Revival is great because it only costs 2 life. And not only can you use it to kind of like recur cards out of your graveyard, but you can use it to hit a lot of key pieces in, like you could flip somebody's, like before somebody gets their Brain Freeze off or goes and gets it, you can hit their LED when they're tied on mana. You can flip a reanimation target back to the top of the library to fizzle the reanimation spell. It's got a lot of uses, and it being free kind of makes it something that is very, very universally very universally useful. Ha ha ha. It just makes it really versatile and very useful. And then, like, let's not forget that, like, we now have land spells. Like, Otawara is a really nice one. I know it's not cheap, but I've been putting this in a lot of blue decks. It's hard to interact with because it's not a spell, it's an ability. People aren't exactly packing stifles because stifles aren't great. I know you can find a million use cases for them, but I tend to see them as very narrow and more of a gotcha card than anything. Otawara is really nice because it will bounce an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, or a planeswalker. Most of the time it's going to cost 3, but the fact that you can kind of play it as a land when you need to, or you have an uncounterable piece of interaction that will bounce Breach mid-turn. Like, that's pretty good. I don't know. Puts on top of the library. Or no. Puts in an owner's hand, sorry. For some reason, I always think that this one turns it. And then we've also got Boseiju. I've actually found, I thought this one was going to be much stronger than it is. It is strong. I just don't use it as much. Oftentimes, the decks that I'm playing that have green in them, I don't want a green utility land. I just want a dual land. So I kind of have been finding it hard to justify using this. And I've got a nice little honorable mention right here in the form of Warping Whale. I get that it costs 2 mana, and I was just kind of shitting on 2 mana interaction. But this one actually I found very useful in particularly decks that run a lot of rocks, and particularly decks that are running a lot of soul lands, because this, you play Soul Ring or Mana Crypt and you can just cast this because it's just too colorless. And all the modes are relatively, like, all the modes are useful. So take the exile target creature with power or toughness 1 or less. That hits Drana, that hits Thrasios, that hits Aven Mind Sensor, just to name a few. Sure, it doesn't get everything, but killing a Dranath in a lot of decks is worth a piece for. Countering a sorcery, kills counters sweepers, and hits most tutors. And then you create a 1/1 that's a mana battery, which is probably the least useful clause. I wouldn't put this in every deck, but I'll play this in like mono red decks or mono green decks when I need a little more stack interaction or protection against like board wipes or protection against Dranath. It's just kind of a solid piece. So I think kind of maybe in closing, I would say that at least for now, I don't really think mid-range is a good term. And I think that as a community, if we can come up with a more accurate description that more exemplifies what we're doing, at least for now, I'll probably start using the term like tempo combo, because decks like Winota, they essentially play like a Delver deck, where you play Winota and then you just keep attacking with her and you shit out more stack pieces. You know what I mean? While you're pressuring life total. So it's just put it in and then you ride it to victory. It's the same thing with like the Breach Oracle decks, where you just kind of land a Rhystic Study, you play some wheels, you eventually go to a Nause. Those are your big payoffs. But at the end of the day, you're using those free commander spells, you're using your slim interaction, you're using your Rhystic Studies, your Croms, to kind of get that advantage till you can close the game and keep pace with your opponents. So anyway, I know this wasn't quite as revolutionary as the stacks video was. That's kind of a har. But I just wanted to kind of touch base on the subject. I've got a little more thoughts. I just don't really have them super fleshed out at this point. And this video is already kind of like 20 plus minutes long, so I didn't really want to go too deep. But again, hit me up in the Discord, hit me up in the comments. I'll and again, just a reminder for anybody who's still watching, I have a Ko-Fi started. my iMac blew up, so I'm recording on like a 20-year-old computer, and I basically have to do this, or not a 12-year-old computer. If you wouldn't mind giving me $1 to help me raise some money to get a new rig, that would be great. But anyway, thanks again. Have a good night.